This is the brain of one of the estimated 48 million Americans who, in 2023, were diagnosed with a substance use disorder, a staggering figure that only hints at the global scale of the issue. On the left is a brain that can enjoy a drink or a high and walk away. On the right, a brain caught in a relentless cycle, where the craving doesn't stop, even when the substance is actively destroying one's life. But this story isn't just about drugs or alcohol. It's about a fundamental human struggle. At the core of addiction lies a universal battle with compulsion, escapism, and the negative patterns we can't seem to break. Why does this happen? And more importantly, what can we do about it? To answer that question, we can delve into the intricate wiring of modern neuroscience, but the most profound answers may come from a place much older, from a man who saw addiction not as a brain disease alone, but as a crisis of the soul. What if addiction isn't just about chemicals or choices, but about a desperate search for meaning and wholeness? Addiction used to be a dirty word, a moral failing whispered about in shame. Families felt a crippling mix of anger and guilt, unsure how to help loved ones plagued by what seemed to be a character flaw. For decades, the simplistic "just say no" campaign framed addiction as a mere choice. We now know the reality is infinitely more complex, a tangled web of biology, psychology, and environment. Still, addiction remains a difficult truth to confront, perhaps because its roots, the desire to escape pain, the search for transcendence, are more common than many of us would care to admit. Have you ever tried to stop doing something and realized you couldn't? You tell yourself you won't check your phone after 10 p.m. But there you are, scrolling through the phantom glow. You swear off junk food, yet the craving pulls you back with an almost magnetic force. That feeling of being at odds with yourself, of your rational mind losing a battle with a primal urge, is a small glimpse into the prison of addiction. For most, that craving eventually fades, but for an addict, the brain has been hijacked. Neuroscience shows us how these substances execute their coup. They flood the brain's reward system, specifically the nucleus accumbens, with a surge of dopamine, a neurotransmitter of motivation and pleasure, far exceeding any natural reward. This intense surge teaches the brain a simple, powerful lesson. This substance is paramount for survival. With repeated use, the brain's prefrontal cortex, the seat of judgment and self-control, weakens. The brain's learning system, through a process called neuroplasticity, rewires itself, pruning away interest in other joys, relationships, hobbies, even food, to create a superhighway dedicated to pursuing the substance. This isn't a choice anymore. It's a deeply ingrained, pathological compulsion. But this only explains the how. It doesn't explain the why. Why does a brain, so brilliantly evolved for survival, create this trap for itself? It was in seeking this deeper why that I discovered the work of Carl Jung. A contemporary of Freud, Jung ventured beyond the mechanics of the mind into the realm of the soul. He believed that addiction was not a primary disease, but a symptom of a deeper spiritual ailment. In a famous letter to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung proposed that the craving for alcohol was a low-level thirst for wholeness, or what in religious language might be called a union with God. He wrote, "You see, alcohol, in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as for the most depraving poison." For Jung, addiction could only be truly healed by a profound spiritual awakening, a journey that begins with confronting the darkest part of ourselves, the shadow. Do you ever feel there's a part of yourself you can't control? A part that makes you do things that cause you to recoil and think, "That's not me." That is your shadow. The shadow is the repository of everything we have repressed and disowned about ourselves. Our fears, our unacceptable desires, our unresolved traumas. Our conscious self, the ego, works tirelessly to keep this shadow buried. The ego is who we believe we are, shaped by society and our choices. The shadow is everything the ego refuses to be. But the irony is, the more we suppress the shadow, the more autonomous and destructive it becomes, fighting for expression in an unconscious, often sabotaging way. Jung argued that addiction is often a desperate attempt to escape the discomfort of the shadow's emergence. Instead of confronting painful truths or traumas, the substance becomes a numbing agent, a way to push the darkness back down. The tragedy is that this act of suppression only strengthens the shadow. The shameful behaviors that accompany addiction, lying, stealing, hurting loved ones, are themselves relegated to the shadow, deepening the psychic split. It becomes a vicious cycle. The growing shadow creates more pain, which demands more of the substance to numb it. This is why shadow work is a cornerstone of deep recovery. It is the courageous process of owning all parts of ourselves, the anger, the envy, the grief. It requires a strong ego to face this darkness without being consumed by it, often requiring guidance through therapy, journaling, or dream work. But the shadow is not purely evil. It also contains our golden shadow, our unrealized potential, our repressed creativity, our raw power that we were taught was too much. By integrating the shadow, we don't just heal, we become more whole, authentic, and powerful. To give this journey a map, Jung identified archetypes, universal patterns, and symbols in our collective unconscious. He saw the path of addiction as a tragic mythological arc. The journey often begins with the orphan or the rebel archetype. Feeling alienated, the orphan uses substances to belong, while the rebel uses them to defy. As the addiction deepens, the trickster takes over, a clever, chaotic force that rationalizes, just one more won't hurt, and manipulates reality to serve the craving. This leads to the destroyer, where life unravels into chaos, loss, and shame, culminating in what is often called rock bottom. But it is at this point of utter defeat that a new archetype can emerge, the wounded healer. Having suffered deeply, the individual transforms that suffering into a source of healing for themselves and others. This is why so many in recovery become counselors and sponsors. They heal through their own wounds. Ultimately, this journey can lead to the wise old man/woman and the hero, who has integrated their darkness and emerged with wisdom and meaning. Viewing addiction through this archetypal lens reframes it from a shameful disease to a symbolic, purposeful, and ultimately heroic journey. This brings us to a crucial debate. Is addiction a disease or a disorder? Calling it a disease destigmatizes it, framing it as a medical issue, not a moral one. The American Medical Association defines it as a chronic brain disease. Yet, this can imply a sense of biological helplessness. Calling it a disorder better captures the psychological and behavioral dimensions, emphasizing that while the brain's function is disrupted, these changes are not irreversible. The brain is neuroplastic. The most comprehensive view is the, quote, biopsychosocial model, which sees addiction as the result of a complex interplay between biological vulnerability, psychological factors like the shadow, and social context. Recovery, then, is a process of profound neuroplasticity. It involves not just stopping the substance, but rewiring the brain by building new habits, exercise, mindfulness, therapy, and reconnecting with natural rewards. But from a Jungian perspective, this is only half the battle. True healing comes from engaging in the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming a whole, integrated self. This involves reconciling the ego with the personal unconscious, integrating the shadow, and connecting with the self, the central archetype of wholeness that is the totality of our psyche. The 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, which Jung influenced, speak of surrendering to a quote, higher power. From a Jungian view, this isn't necessarily an external deity. It is the ego's surrender of its illusion of control to the wisdom of the self. The addiction cycle is driven by compulsion and results in a loss of identity. The individuation process is guided by meaning and self-awareness, and it allows us to emerge as our authentic selves. Jung's ideas, like his theory of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, often lack the empirical data demanded by modern science. We can explain seeing the car you want to buy everywhere as simple pattern recognition. And yet, for someone in recovery, these moments can feel like profound guideposts, nudges from the universe, that they are on the right path. Perhaps the ultimate synthesis is this. Modern neuroscience gives us the how, meticulously mapping the brain's tragic hijacking. Jungian psychology gives us the why, exploring the soul's desperate search for wholeness that made it vulnerable in the first place. Jung was revolutionary because he was one of the first to see addiction not as a moral failing, but as a misguided spiritual quest. The most effective path to recovery honors both truths, healing the brain and nourishing the soul. The crucial thing to remember is that recovery is not only possible, it can lead to a life of greater depth and meaning than the one that existed before. By confronting the shadow and rebalancing the brain, one can become not just sober, but a more complete and freer version of themselves.